You're 42. Who's going to hire you now?" My brother laughed. Dad didn't even look up from his plate. "Try cleaning jobs," Mom smirked. "And don't expect us to lend you money." Dinner kept moving like nothing had happened. Plates scraped. Someone reached for salt. The television murmured in the background, a steady stream of voices reporting on a world that clearly didn't pause for personal collapses. I had rehearsed a sentence in my head, simple, factual. I was laid off. I said it. That was it. No trembling, no dramatics. I expected at least one follow-up question, some reflex of concern. Instead, my words landed and slid off the table like a spill no one wanted to wipe up. My brother Kevin smiled the way he always did when he felt safe enough to be entertained. He'd always been good at reading rooms, especially rooms where I was the punchline. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't ask how I felt. He laughed because laughter was easy and because it had always been allowed when it came to me. The sound cut through the quiet hum of the evening, sharp and dismissive, the kind of laugh that doesn't expect a response because it doesn't consider you worthy of one. Dad kept eating. He was precise about his routine, as if keeping his eyes on his plate would keep the situation contained. "Try cleaning jobs," he said, not unkindly, as if offering a practical fix to a leaky faucet. It wasn't meant to hurt. That made it worse. Advice delivered without curiosity carries an authority that leaves no room for argument. He cut his steak into identical squares, methodical, unhurried, as though my announcement had been nothing more than a brief interruption in an otherwise predictable evening. Mom watched my face the way she always did in moments like this, measuring, assessing, ready to reframe. Her smile came with a warning built in, "And don't expect us to lend you money." The sentence was neat, complete. Boundaries drawn in advance just in case I'd imagined some safety net that had never been there. She reached for her wine glass, took a sip, and set it down with the practiced ease of someone who had already moved on to the next topic in her mind. No one asked what 20 years looked like when they ended. No one asked how it felt to hand in a badge and walk out without a box, because there was nothing personal left to carry. The conversation shifted to grocery prices. Kevin made a joke about gas. I chewed without tasting anything and wondered when exactly I had stopped being a person at this table and become a category. This wasn't new. That was the part that made it sting in a dull, familiar way. In our family, Kevin was the headline. I was the footnote. He took risks. I was responsible. He failed loudly. I succeeded quietly. When he stumbled, there were explanations. Stress, bad timing, circumstances beyond his control. When I succeeded, it was expected ordinary, unremarkable, something anyone could do if they just kept their head down and tried harder. I remembered bringing home report cards that stayed on the counter for a day before disappearing into a drawer. I remembered promotions announced in passing like weather updates, while his achievements became stories told to relatives over holiday dinners, embellished with each retelling until they became legend. I learned early that my role wasn't to shine. It was to stabilize. I was the one who handled things, the one who didn't need help, the one who would be fine. Losing my job cracked that unspoken contract. Not because the job defined me, but because it gave the family a way to measure me. Without it, I had no defense they recognized. To them, it wasn't an economic shift or a corporate decision. It was proof. Evidence that their quiet doubts had been justified all along. The daughter who had always been competent had finally revealed herself to be what they'd suspected, ordinary, vulnerable, in need of the same kind of management they reserved for problems. "Something will come up," Mom added, already turning to clear a plate. The phrase sounded generous, but it carried an ending, something smaller. Something that fit the new picture they were sketching in real time. I nodded, because nodding cost nothing, and arguing would have required energy I wasn't willing to spend on an audience that had already decided the verdict. The realization came slowly then, all at once. I wasn't just unemployed. I was uninvited from plans, from expectations from the future they imagined for themselves. The suggestions weren't suggestions. They were closures. Each one shut a door and labeled it realistic. Each one took something I might have reached for and moved it out of sight beyond my grasp into a category marked "not for you." I didn't defend myself. I didn't list the projects I'd led or the teams I'd built. I didn't say that my performance reviews had been spotless, that my calendar had been booked months in advance, that the decision had come from above like a weather event no one could stop. Explaining would have sounded like pleading. Pleading would have confirmed the role they were ready to hand me. So I watched, I listened. I took inventory not of what I'd lost, but of how quickly they'd let me go. When the plates were cleared and the room loosened into small talk, I stood. No one noticed right away. No one asked where I was going or when I'd be back. I didn't make an announcement. I didn't need permission. The chair slid back with a soft scrape, and that sound felt louder than anything I'd said all night. Upstairs, the house sounded different, hollow in places I'd never noticed. The hallway stretched longer than I remembered, the carpet muffling my footsteps as I walked to the room I used when I visited. I closed the door to the room that still held boxes I hadn't bothered to unpack years ago. I sat on the edge of the bed and waited for something dramatic to happen. It didn't. There was no sobbing, no spiral, just a strange clarity, sharp enough to feel calm. The kind of clarity that comes when you've been holding your breath for so long that finally exhaling feels like a revelation. I opened my laptop. The screen lit up patient and blank. For a moment, I hovered over the keyboard, not sure what I was supposed to type first. A resume update, a job alert, an apology email to a company that had already moved on. Instead, I opened a new file, untitled. The cursor blinked steady, indifferent. I didn't fill it with words. I made a list, names, numbers, fragments of conversations I'd had over the years. People who'd called me when something was broken and needed fixing. Situations I'd stepped into without a title and left with results. I didn't reach out. Not yet. I just wrote. Skills don't evaporate because someone else controls the payroll. Downstairs, laughter rose and fell. Kevin told another story. I could hear the rhythm of it, the pauses where he waited for appreciation, the peaks where voices rose in response. My parents listened the way they always listened to him, with attention and engagement, with the kind of presence they never quite managed to offer me. They believed the night had resolved itself. They believed I'd absorbed the lesson and would adjust accordingly. I saved the file without naming it. I closed the laptop and left it on the desk open enough to remind me it was there. On my phone, my contacts waited untouched. The future they erased was only the one they'd imagined for me. The rest was still unclaimed. They thought they had watched something finish. I knew better. My phone rang the next morning while I was making coffee, and before I even looked at the screen, I knew it was my mother. The timing was too precise, early enough to catch me before I'd fully woken, late enough that she could claim she'd been considerate about the hour. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't mention the night before. Her voice went straight to logistics, calm and efficient, like we were discussing travel plans instead of my life. "I've been thinking," she said. "It's probably best if you don't tell the rest of the family about the job thing yet." I leaned against the counter and let her keep talking, watching the coffee drip slowly into the pot. She explained it wasn't about shame, not really, just timing. People talk. People worry. There was no need to make things bigger than they were. "Let's keep it simple," she finished. "We don't want this to turn into a whole situation." I realized then that silence wasn't a suggestion. It was an assignment. My role wasn't to heal or figure things out. My role was to make sure everything still looked fine from the outside, to maintain the family's carefully curated image, the one where everyone was successful and stable and had their lives together. That expectation hadn't appeared overnight. It had been planted years ago, the first time I learned that speaking up carried consequences I would be expected to manage alone. I was young enough that my feet didn't reach the floor when I sat at the kitchen table, old enough to know when something wasn't fair. A teacher had blamed me for something I hadn't done, a disruption in class that had been caused by the boy behind me who had learned early that girls made convenient scapegoats. I remember the heat in my chest, the certainty that if I explained it clearly, it would be fixed. Justice was simple at that age. Truth equaled resolution. At home, I told the story exactly as it happened, every detail lined up, every fact in place. I described the injustice with the righteous indignation of a child who still believed that adults would fix unfair things once they understood them. My mother interrupted before I finished. "You're making it worse," she said, her voice carrying that particular blend of exhaustion and warning that I would come to know so well. My father sighed, already tired. Sometimes it's better to let things go. Kevin sat quietly at the other end of the table, watching, protected by his silence, while mine was labeled dramatic. He didn't defend me. He didn't even look at me. He was learning the same lesson I was, but from a different angle, that my discomfort was acceptable, even expected, while his comfort was to be preserved at all costs. I learned something that day. Truth wasn't enough. Tone mattered. Convenience mattered more. And when inconvenience threatened the calm of the room, it was my job to absorb it. That lesson repeated itself in different forms over the years. When Kevin missed deadlines or made a bad call, there was always an explanation ready for him. Stress, pressure, too much on his plate. The family closed ranks around him instinctively, like a reflex they didn't even notice. When I struggled, the language shifted. "You're capable," they said. "You'll figure it out." It sounded like confidence, but it functioned as distance. I didn't need help because I could handle it. I didn't need backup because I was reliable. Over time, reliability became a way to disappear. I didn't resent him for it. That wasn't the feeling. What settled in instead was an understanding of the rules. If he failed, it was an event, something that happened to him, something external, something that required support and understanding. If I failed, it was a flaw, something wrong with me, something internal, something that required correction. I remember a specific moment years later when money was tight after a decision Kevin made that didn't pan out. Some investment scheme, a friend had talked him into something about cryptocurrency or startups or one of those ventures that sounds brilliant until it isn't. The loss was significant enough that it affected his mortgage, his car payment, his lifestyle. It was discussed openly, problem-solving voices filling the room, options were weighed, support was offered. My parents talked about helping with a loan. They discussed whether he should move back home temporarily. They strategized about how to restructure his debt. The whole family mobilized around the problem as though it were a natural disaster that had struck an innocent victim. Not long after, I mentioned a challenge of my own, smaller but immediate. A car repair that had come at a bad time, just when my emergency fund had been depleted by another unexpected expense. Nothing dramatic, nothing life-altering, but enough that I was feeling the squeeze. The response was quick, almost affectionate. "You're good with this stuff," my mother said. "You'll manage." And I did. I always did. That was the bargain. I handled myself quietly, and in return, I wasn't a burden. Silence wasn't obedience. It was survival. After I lost my job, the pattern snapped back into place with alarming ease. Messages from relatives came in well-meaning and vague. I answered them carefully, downplaying everything using the kind of language that smoothed edges. "I'm taking some time." It was a restructure. "I'm exploring options." Each response earned a nod of approval from my parents, visible even when they weren't in the room. My mother's voice softened when she heard how calm I sounded. My father relaxed. Kevin's name came up in conversation more often, followed by praise that felt automatic: his job, his apartment, his plans. The household settled. My silence was working again. And that was the problem. The quiet made everything easier for them and smaller for me. I could feel it happening in real time, the way my presence shrank to fit the comfort of others. I wasn't lying. I wasn't pretending. I was simply editing myself out of my own story sentence by sentence. The piece it created felt thin, brittle, like glass that would cut if I leaned on it too hard. A few days later, I ran into someone from my old professional circle, someone I hadn't spoken to since before the layoff. We met by accident, a brief overlap at a coffee shop neither of us frequented. When I mentioned casually that I was between roles, his reaction startled me. He frowned, not in pity, but confusion. "That doesn't make sense," he said. He asked questions my family never had. What projects I'd been leading, what kind of decisions I'd been making, what the company's reasoning had been. He listened the way people listen when they're actually interested in the answer rather than waiting for their turn to speak. He shook his head slowly. "They're calling you done," he asked, incredulous. "That's not how people see you. You were running circles around half the senior team." The sentence landed harder than any insult could have. It wasn't praise, it was a correction. I went home with that question echoing in my head. That's not how people see you. The gap between that statement and my family's assumptions was suddenly impossible to ignore. One group saw capacity, the other saw risk. One group expected contribution, the other expected containment. For the first time, I considered the possibility that my silence hadn't been protecting me. It had been misrepresenting me. I didn't confront anyone. That would have been too loud, too familiar, too easy to dismiss. Instead, I started changing smaller things. I let messages sit unanswered longer. I stopped preemptively reassuring everyone. When my mother hinted again about keeping things quiet, I didn't argue, but I didn't agree either. I listened. I acknowledged. I moved on. The absence of my usual compliance created a subtle tension, the kind that doesn't announce itself but lingers. I could feel it when conversations paused, when expectations didn't land the way they used to. My mother would make a suggestion, wait for my automatic agreement, and find only silence. My father would hint at something expecting me to volunteer, and I would simply nod and change the subject. The realization came without drama. Silence had served its purpose. It kept me safe when I needed safety. It had kept the peace when peace mattered more than truth. But now it was costing me visibility, agency, and momentum. What had once been a strategy had turned into a trap. I wasn't done being quiet. I was done being invisible. The meeting was framed as a courtesy, a clean ending to something that had already been decided. We sat across from each other in a glass-walled room that looked exactly the same as it always had, except now I was a visitor instead of a fixture. The same conference table where I'd led countless strategy sessions. The same whiteboards where I'd mapped out solutions to problems that had seemed insurmountable until they weren't. The same view of the city skyline that I'd watched through late nights and early mornings. My former manager thanked me for my time, my contributions, my professionalism. The words came out in the right order, practiced enough to sound sincere. He had a script, I realized. Not literally, but something he'd rehearsed probably with HR, probably multiple times. The phrases were too smooth, too complete. They didn't leave room for deviation. I waited until he finished, then asked the only question that mattered. What did I do wrong? He didn't hesitate, which should have reassured me. This isn't personal, he said. It's just business. HR nodded, eyes lowered, fingers folded. No one could point to a mistake. No one could name a gap. The chair had been pulled out from under me without a sound, and the silence afterward was being sold as grace. I left the building with the strange feeling that I'd missed something obvious. Not a warning sign, I'd looked for those, but a pattern. Something systemic rather than personal. Something that explained why a 20-year career could end with such neat, clean sentences. That night I opened my laptop and pulled up everything I still had access to: performance reviews, project summaries, emails from leadership praising outcomes they'd been happy to take credit for. I read them like evidence, not nostalgia. The language was consistent: strong results, reliable execution, trusted judgment. Nothing in those files pointed to failure. Riley consistently exceeds expectations. Her team's performance improved 40% under her leadership, essential to the successful completion of the Henderson project. The words were glowing, unambiguous. They told a story of value, of contribution, of indispensability. I lined them up next to the names of the people who were still there, people I'd trained, people who had come to me when decisions needed to be made. The difference wasn't subtle once I stopped looking for it where I'd been taught to look. They were younger, cheaper, easier to mold. They had smaller salaries, fewer benefits, less institutional memory that might complicate decisions management wanted to make quickly. The math was simple enough to embarrass me for not seeing it sooner. A few days later, I met a former colleague for coffee, someone who had survived the cut, but only just. We weren't close enough for comfort, which made the conversation easier. He spoke carefully at first, then stopped pretending there was anything left to protect. They knew months ago, he said, stirring his coffee without drinking it. The restructure had been mapped out well in advance, lists drawn up, names categorized by cost and longevity. Mine had been highlighted early, not because I was underperforming, but because I was settled, established, harder to justify on a spreadsheet that didn't account for institutional memory or risk management.
There was a meeting, he continued, before the announcement. They went through the org chart and assigned a dollar value to every position, not the work, not the output, just the cost. Anyone over a certain threshold got flagged for review. The review was basically automatic. If you were flagged, you were gone. I hadn't been fired. I'd been scheduled. The confirmation landed with a dull weight. It wasn't rage I felt, or even betrayal in the dramatic sense. It was clarity, the kind that strips emotion out of a situation and leaves only facts. I went home and searched for my old position out of habit, not expectation. The listing was already live, the same job posted within a week of my departure. The description matched my role almost word for word, softened at the edges with phrases like fast-paced and cultural fit. Energetic, adaptable, dynamic. A role designed to sound open while quietly narrowing the field. They didn't need someone better than me. They needed someone easier. I closed the posting and opened the draft email I'd started the day I left, the one meant to thank the company for the opportunity, for the growth, for the lessons. I read it once, then deleted it without saving. Gratitude felt misplaced now, not because I was bitter, but because the relationship had never been what I'd believed it was. Loyalty, it turned out, was a one-way arrangement. The system didn't remember sacrifices. It recorded costs. As the days passed, the story my family told themselves began to unravel in my head. This wasn't a personal collapse. It wasn't a failure to adapt. It was a process playing out exactly as designed. I spoke to another contact, then another, and the pattern repeated with unsettling consistency. Layoffs everywhere, restructures, right-sizing, all the corporate euphemisms for the same fundamental truth. It's happening everywhere. One of them said, a woman I'd worked with years ago who was now facing her own transition. "You're not special. That's the problem." The phrase should have hurt. Instead, it relieved something I hadn't realized I was carrying. The shame I'd been assigned didn't belong to me. It was systemic, impersonal, efficient. That realization changed how I moved. I stopped tailoring my resume to fit roles that no longer wanted people like me. I stopped writing cover letters that framed experience as flexibility, that apologized for my years in the industry, that tried to make myself smaller to fit into boxes designed for someone cheaper. The rules I'd been following had shifted, and I'd been losing by playing them well. I started watching instead of applying, tracking where money went, who made decisions, who got protected when things went wrong. The game wasn't about competence. It was about insulation. One afternoon, sitting alone with my notes spread out in front of me, the final piece clicked into place. I wasn't unemployed. I was unprotected. And once I understood that, the problem stopped feeling personal and started looking solvable. I didn't decide to move back in. It was decided for me, delivered as a practical conclusion to a problem I hadn't finished explaining. My father said it plainly, like a solution already vetted by committee. Staying at home would save money. It would simplify things. Just for a little while. The words were reasonable, even caring, wrapped in the language of practicality that made disagreement feel ungrateful. My mother followed with logistics before I could answer, outlining which room I'd use, how meals would work, what days made sense for errands. She had already reorganized the guest room in her mind, already allocated shelf space and drawer assignments. The tone was helpful, efficient, and unarguable. No one asked if I wanted it. No one waited for consent. The support arrived fully formed, and I stepped into it because stepping aside would have required a fight I didn't yet know how to start. The first week felt easier than I expected. Food appeared without effort. The house had a rhythm that didn't ask questions. There was comfort in not having to decide small things, in letting someone else hold the edges while I recalibrated. The refrigerator was always stocked. The laundry was done. The routines of the house absorbed me without requiring anything in return except compliance. That ease came with a quiet trade I didn't notice right away. Suggestions replaced choices. "You might want to head out earlier," my mother said one morning, glancing at the clock as I poured my coffee. "Traffic gets bad around 9. "It's probably better if you're back by dinner," my father added later, casual, reasonable, not even looking up from his newspaper. "Your mother worries." Nothing was demanded. Everything was tracked. My comings and goings registered like data points collected without comment but noted nonetheless. I could feel eyes following me to the door, measuring the time between my departure and return, calculating something I wasn't supposed to see. I adjusted without announcing it. I changed the times I left so I wouldn't have to explain where I was going. I ate earlier or later to avoid overlapping schedules. I took calls outside, pacing the driveway, when the house felt too close, my breath visible in the cold air as I discussed job leads and opportunities that felt increasingly distant. No one accused me of anything. That was the brilliance of it. The pressure never spiked high enough to resist. It just narrowed my movements until resistance felt inefficient. I wasn't being criticized. I was being managed. When relatives stopped by or called, my introduction came pre-packaged. "She's taking a break," my mother would say, smiling that careful smile she reserved for public consumption. "She's regrouping." Sometimes it was, "She's at home for a bit." And the words were gentle, almost flattering, but they flattened everything. I was into a temporary state with no direction. I didn't correct anyone. My parents didn't either. The story settled into place, told often enough that it became easier to repeat than to revise. If I didn't speak the version of me they preferred, moved forward unchallenged. Kevin's approach was different, smoother. He didn't tease or provoke. He didn't need to. One afternoon, he sat across from me at the kitchen table with his phone face down on the Surface posture, open voice low, like he was sharing a favor. The performance of intimacy was convincing enough to make me listen. "I've been asking around," he said. "There's a position at a friend's company, administrative, stable, nothing crazy, but it's something." He talked about the role like it was a gift, low pressure, sensible for someone recalibrating. He framed it as care, as alignment with where I was in life. He didn't say I couldn't do more. He implied I shouldn't want to. The options he described all lived comfortably below the version of me he recognized. I listened, nodding at the right moments, and understood something I hadn't. Before his concern had boundaries. It stopped where my unpredictability began. He wanted me stable and contained predictable enough that I wouldn't disrupt the family dynamics that had always served him so well. No one asked about my long-term plans. That absence spoke louder than any question could have. There was no timeline for returning to anything, no curiosity about momentum. The house operated as if this version of my life was stable, indefinite. Expectations were quietly revised downward, then treated as reasonable. I felt it in the way conversations moved past me, in the way decisions were made with the assumption that I would adapt. Staying meant accepting a future already sketched in someone else's handwriting. The clarity came from an unexpected place. I ran into an acquaintance while out on an errand, someone who knew me only professionally, who had no stake in my comfort. We exchanged pleasantries, the usual updates, and when the subject of work came up, I kept it vague out of habit. He tilted his head, considering me. "Careful," he said, not unkindly. "The longer you disappear, the harder it is to reappear." There was no judgment in his voice, no advice layered with ego, just a fact delivered cleanly. I nodded, thanked him, and walked away with the uneasy sense that time was doing something to me while I stood still. That night I looked around the room I'd been assigned, the one that was meant to be temporary, but arranged as if permanence was expected. My belongings fit too easily. The walls didn't hold me the way they once had. The ceiling felt lower than I remembered, the space smaller, the air thicker with expectations I hadn't agreed to. I understood then that nothing in this house was actively hostile. That was the trap. The containment was gentle, almost loving, and therefore harder to refuse, but it was containment all the same. My choices were being replaced with conveniences. My agency was being exchanged for calm. I didn't announce my decision. I didn't sit anyone down or explain my reasoning. I started packing quietly, folding clothes with care, stacking books without ceremony. When my mother asked what I was doing, I said I was organizing. That was true. When my father mentioned dinner plans for the weekend, I said I wasn't sure yet. Also true. I moved through the house with the same politeness I always had, the same efficiency, and watched as the system adjusted too slowly to stop me. The morning I left, there was no confrontation. I carried my bag to the car and set it in the trunk. The house looked the same behind me, unchanged, ready to absorb the space I vacated without comment. No one asked me to stay. No one needed reassurance. The support that had arrived without asking didn't require a goodbye. As I pulled away, the thought settled with a certainty that surprised me. Staying was costing me more than leaving ever would. No one asked why I was there. That was the first thing I noticed. I walked into rooms that were clean, busy, efficient, filled with people who spoke in shorthand and moved with purpose, and not a single person paused to wonder how I'd arrived or what I'd lost to be standing among them. Conversations didn't begin with backstories. They began with utility. What are you looking for? Who are you representing? What do you bring to the table? The questions weren't hostile. They weren't curious either. They were transactional, asked the way you ask about square footage or interest rates. If you didn't represent something tangible, you faded into the background without ceremony. I tried answering honestly at first. I talked about experience, about teams I'd led, budgets I'd managed, problems I'd solved quietly while other people took credit. People listened, nodded, even smiled. Then the follow-up questions came, always circling the same absence. Who's backing you? Do you have the authority to decide? Are you signing anything? My words floated politely through the air and landed nowhere. A resume, I learned quickly, was not a form of currency here. It was context at best, trivia at worst. Without position, without leverage, it couldn't be exchanged for anything of value. That was when the real estate conversation stopped sounding abstract and started sounding final. Zoning restrictions, debt coverage ratios, cap rates adjusted depending on whose assumptions you trusted. I realized quickly that this industry didn't reward confidence the way corporate rooms pretended to. It rewarded fluency. People didn't care where you came from or how long you'd survived elsewhere. They cared whether you understood how risk moved through a deal, who absorbed it when projections missed, and how clean your numbers stayed once optimism was stripped out. When someone asked what I did, they weren't asking for a title. They were asking what side of the balance sheet I belonged on. I spent hours reading offering memorandums that tried to sound neutral while quietly redirecting attention away from their weak points. Deferred maintenance framed as future upside. Rent growth that assumed cooperation instead of contracts. Timelines that collapsed the moment one variable shifted. In real estate, nothing stays theoretical for long. Every promise turns into a line item. Every delay accrues interest. The clarity was brutal, but it was honest. No one cared how hard you worked. They cared how exposed you were when things went wrong. I took a small role by choice, not desperation. That distinction mattered to me at the time. The work was defined as temporary low risk, a way to stay active while I recalibrated. No title worth mentioning, no decision-making power. I told myself it was strategic, that performance would speak louder than position. I delivered everything asked of me, and more, anticipating needs, closing gaps before they widened. I arrived early and stayed late. I learned the systems and the shortcuts. I made myself useful in 100 small ways. When the moment came to make a call that carried consequences, the room shifted. Voices lowered. Eyes slid past me. Someone else stepped in. Someone with a name that carried weight, and the decision moved forward without my input. The project succeeded. I was thanked. The outcome didn't change my standing. It confirmed it. Effort didn't raise my value. It lowered my price. There was no betrayal in it. No broken promises. No one had misled me. The rules were consistent. I just hadn't known them. I was useful, therefore replaceable. Reliable, therefore safe to ignore. I wasn't being tested. I was being contained within the boundaries of what I could risk for someone else without risking anything myself. The realization settled slowly, not as anger, but as clarity. This wasn't about fairness. It was about exposure. I had none. The sentence that clarified everything came from a man I barely knew, someone whose name I'd forget if it weren't attached to that moment. We stood off to the side after a long discussion, the kind that goes nowhere but takes hours to do it. He looked at me, considering not unkindly. "You don't look like a risk someone else should take," he said. He didn't mention my age. He didn't reference my employment status. He didn't apologize. He stated a fact as cleanly as possible.
I thanked him because there was nothing else to do. The market wasn't questioning my competence. It was measuring my capacity to absorb loss. By that metric, I was cheap. Once I stopped trying to impress, I started watching. I noticed who drew attention without raising their voice, whose presence shifted conversations before they spoke. It wasn't brilliance. It wasn't confidence. It was ownership. People leaned toward those who had something to lose because loss implied skin in the game. Money moved toward names that could absorb impact, toward people who could stand behind decisions with more than reputation. Ideas were plentiful. Accountability was scarce. The currency wasn't intelligence. It was collateral. The language around me changed as my understanding did. Words like opportunity and potential faded into the background. I started hearing leverage exposure downside. I listened to a story about a deal that nearly collapsed, salvaged not by expertise, but by someone willing to sign their name where it hurt. No committee, no safety net, just a person willing to absorb consequences. The room respected that more than any presentation I'd ever seen. That was when it clicked. I didn't need permission. I needed leverage. I went quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence. I stopped pitching myself. I stopped asking what roles were available. I asked different questions to different people and wrote the answers down without commentary. I learned how assets moved, how debt worked when it was intentional instead of accidental. I studied cash flow the way I used to study org charts tracing power instead of hierarchy. There was nothing glamorous about it. No rush, just disciplined repetition, the slow replacement of old assumptions with new math. An offer came that would have made sense to the version of me that wanted stability. It was clean, defined, comfortable. The compensation was decent. The expectations were clear. I listened all the way through, asked a few polite questions, and declined. There was no drama in it, no explanation beyond thanks. Walking away felt heavier than I expected, not because I doubted the decision, but because I understood what I was choosing instead. I was choosing risk without applause, responsibility without validation. I was choosing to stop being hireable so I could stop being replaceable. As I left, the room didn't follow me with its eyes. No one needed to. The market had done its work. It had priced me accurately based on the information I'd allowed it to see. The adjustment was mine to make. The listing didn't look like an opportunity. It looked like a problem no one wanted to stay with long enough to explain. A duplex in a transitional neighborhood, 1 unit vacant, one barely occupied the kind of asset that sits just below most investors' filters. The photos were flat and defensive wide angles that tried too hard to make the rooms feel larger than they were. The notes used familiar phrases, motivated seller, value-add potential, without anchoring any of them to facts. I had seen dozens of listings like this in the weeks I'd spent watching the market, learning to read between the lines of broker language. Most of them were traps, dressed as opportunities. This one felt different, though I couldn't have explained why at the time. I asked for the inspection reports before I asked for the price. The broker, a woman named Diane, who had been doing this long enough to stop pretending, paused long enough for the silence to register. Then she sent them over with a message that read like courtesy and warning at the same time. "Most buyers want the story first," she wrote. "You're the first one who asked for numbers. Most didn't want to know what they were inheriting until they were already attached to the idea of owning it. That attachment was expensive. It clouded judgment, made people negotiate against themselves, turned buyers into believers instead of analysts. I had spent 20 years watching that pattern in corporate settings, people falling in love with ideas before understanding the cost of executing them. I wasn't going to make the same mistake with my own money. The inspection told a cleaner story than the listing ever could. The roof wasn't failing, but it had been patched repeatedly instead of replaced 7 different patches over the years, each one a temporary fix that had become permanent by default. I could trace the history in the layers of tar and shingle each repair, representing a decision to defer rather than solve. Plumbing had been rerouted years ago without permits functional but undocumented, a tangle of pipes that worked until someone needed to sell or refinance. The electrical panel still carried load, but no longer met current code, a 60-amp service in a world that demanded 200.
None of it was catastrophic. All of it was friction. Friction scares people who need certainty. For someone willing to absorb process, it was leverage. Every problem I identified was a reason for other buyers to walk away. Every reason they walked away was a point of negotiation I could use. The math wasn't complicated once you stopped looking at problems as obstacles and started seeing them as information. I drove by on a weekday afternoon and didn't get out of the car right away. I sat with the engine running, watching the block instead of the building. How fast cars moved slow enough to suggest residents, not commuters, cutting through. Where people parked on driveways, mostly not abandoned on streets. Which neighboring properties showed recent permits and which hadn't been touched in years. A new coffee shop on the corner, the kind with handwritten signs and a line out the door. A playground down the street that looked well-maintained, the equipment bright and modern. Mothers walking strollers in pairs, talking easily. An older man washing his car in a driveway, taking his time, not rushing. Stability isn't advertised. It shows itself quietly if you're patient enough to look. The neighborhood wasn't gentrifying in the aggressive, displacement-driven way that made headlines. It was stabilizing families, putting down roots, businesses, investing in storefronts, people treating their homes like places to stay rather than assets to flip. That kind of stability doesn't guarantee returns, but it reduces the variables that can destroy them. I got out of the car and walked the perimeter of the building. The paint was peeling near the foundation, water damage from gutters that hadn't been cleaned in years. The windows were old but intact single-pane glass that would need replacing eventually but wasn't urgent. The yard was overgrown but not abandoned. Someone had mowed within the last month, just not with any care. I stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the roofline, counting the patches Diane's report had mentioned. 7 visible from where I stood, probably more on the back side. A woman walked by with a dog, nodded at me without stopping. Normal, unremarkable. That was what I was looking for. The seller wasn't desperate. He was exhausted. His name was Frank, and when we met at a coffee shop near the property, he spoke in the clipped sentences of someone who had already made his decision and just needed the paperwork to catch up. His hands were rough, calloused from years of fixing things himself. His eyes were tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He ordered black coffee and didn't touch it. Taxes had crept up over the years. Insurance had followed. The vacant unit should have been carrying the property, but compliance issues made it feel like a fight he didn't want anymore. He'd owned the building for 18 years, inherited it from an uncle who'd bought it in the 70s. For most of that time, it had been steady income, nothing spectacular, just reliable. Then the city changed the electrical codes. Then the insurance company raised rates after a claim on the roof. Then his wife got sick, and the time he used to spend on maintenance went to hospitals and pharmacies instead. "I'm not looking for a bidding war," he said. "I'm looking for someone who won't call me in 6 months complaining about surprises." "I've read the inspection reports," I said. "All of them." He looked at me for a long moment. "Most people skim. Most people don't know what they're looking at." He almost smiled. "You know what you're getting into. I know exactly what I'm getting into. That's why I'm still here." That kind of seller doesn't want clever ideas. He wants the problem to stop being his, and that clarity, his exhaustion meeting my precision, created space for a deal that worked for both of us. Not because I was taking advantage of his situation, but because I was the only buyer willing to meet it honestly. I ran the numbers 3 times, then once more, assuming every line item drifted in the wrong direction. Higher insurance 15% above current rates instead of the 10% I'd projected. Slower, lease up 60 days instead of 30. A longer permitting window 8 weeks instead of 4. Unexpected repairs, a contingency of $10,000 I hoped I wouldn't need. Even then, the deal only barely worked. Cash flow positive by a margin thin enough to punish arrogance. There was no room for best-case assumptions, no buffer for ego, just a narrow corridor where discipline mattered more than optimism. I sat with those numbers for 3 days. I didn't call anyone to validate them. I didn't ask if I was being reckless. I woke up at 3 a.m. on the second night and recalculated the debt service ratio by hand just to make sure I hadn't made an error. I hadn't. The deal was tight but real.
The risk was substantial but defined. I understood exactly what I was buying, and that clarity made the next step possible. The down payment consumed most of my available capital. Not all of it, but enough that reversing course would hurt. I transferred the funds on a Tuesday morning, watching the numbers leave my account with a strange mixture of terror and calm. This was it. The moment when theory became consequence. The lender's questions were methodical, not suspicious. Experience, track record, reserves. I answered cleanly where I could and let the gaps remain visible. There was no point in pretending to be something I wasn't. Either the deal made sense on its own terms, or it didn't. "Who's backing you?" he asked. "No one." The pause that followed recalibrated the entire conversation. He looked at me differently after that, not with skepticism, but with a kind of respect that comes from recognizing someone willing to bet on themselves. He didn't argue or advise. He simply adjusted the terms to match the risk. Higher rate, shorter term, more documentation. Capital behaves honestly when it has nowhere else to hide. The closing was uneventful. No ceremony, no feeling of arrival, just signatures, wire confirmations, and the quiet transfer of responsibility. The title company's office smelled like old carpet and printer ink. The notary had a cold and kept apologizing for sniffling. The whole process took 45 minutes. When I walked back to my car, the building looked the same. Same peeling paint, same overgrown yard, same patches on the roof, but something had shifted that I couldn't see from the outside. I didn't look the same, not to myself. Ownership changes how weight distributes itself. Every decision now carries consequences. Every delay costs money. Every problem was mine to solve with no one else to blame and no one else to catch me if I fell. I sat in my car for a long time before driving away. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt heavy in a way that was new but not unwelcome. This was real now. The spreadsheets had become walls and pipes and electrical panels. The projections had become tenants and inspectors and contractors. There was no going back to theory. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, running numbers in my head, second-guessing every assumption I'd made. What if the electrical upgrade cost more than projected? What if the vacant unit didn't lease in 60 days? What if Harold decided to move out and I was left with 2 empty units and a mortgage I couldn't cover? I got up at 2 a.m. and made coffee. I opened my laptop and went through the inspection reports again, page by page, looking for something I might have missed. I found nothing new. The problems were exactly what I'd accounted for. The solutions were exactly what I'd planned. The risk was exactly what I'd accepted. But accepting risk in theory and living with it in practice are different things. Theory doesn't wake you up at night. Theory doesn't make your chest tight when you think about all the ways things could go wrong. I sat at my kitchen table in the dark, drinking coffee that had gone cold, and wondered if I had made a terrible mistake. Then I opened a new document and started making a list. Day 1 tasks, Day 2 tasks, Week 1 priorities, Week 2 milestones. If I was going to be awake anyway, I might as well be useful. By the time the sun came up, I had a plan. Not a perfect plan. There's no such thing but a clear one. Something to follow when the uncertainty felt overwhelming. The first week made the reality clear. The existing tenant, a retired machinist named Harold, who had lived in the downstairs unit for 11 years, called about inconsistent water pressure on Day 2. His voice was gruff, but not hostile, the voice of a man who had learned to expect disappointment and was surprised when it didn't arrive. "The last owner never fixed anything," he said. "Just want to know if you're going to be different." "I'm going to fix the water pressure," I said. "It might take a week to get the plumber scheduled, but I'll fix it." Silence on the line. Then, "All right." That was the entire conversation. But I understood what he was really asking. He was asking if I was going to be someone he could rely on, or someone he'd have to work around. I intended to be the former. The vacant unit failed final inspection because of the electrical panel exactly as I'd expected. The inspector was a tired man in his 50s who'd clearly seen too many investors try to cut corners. He went through the violations methodically, not unkindly, just thoroughly. "You knew about this before you bought it?" he asked. "Yes." He looked at me with something like surprise. "Most people act shocked. Most people don't read the reports." He almost smiled. Get the panel upgraded, get the permits closed, call me back. I'll fit you in. The contractor I'd planned to use, a guy named Ray, who came highly recommended by 2 different investors I'd spoken to, declined after walking through the property and realizing the job would require staged work instead of a fast cosmetic turnaround. "I don't do complicated things," he said, not apologetically. "I do volume. In and out, 30 days, next project. This isn't that." I didn't argue. He was right, this wasn't a quick flip. This was a stabilization, and it needed someone willing to work through problems instead of around them. None of it was dramatic. All of it was cumulative. This is the part people compress into a paragraph when they tell the story later. There were some challenges, but we worked through them. That sentence erases weeks of phone calls, early morning spreadsheet revisions, and the constant low-grade anxiety of watching money flow out while hoping income would eventually flow in. Living it doesn't feel like momentum. It feels like managing friction without losing time. I found a smaller contractor named Marcus, a one-man operation with a truck that looked older than my career. He showed up to our first meeting in work boots and a flannel shirt that had seen better decades. His handshake was firm. His questions were specific. "Do you want this done right or done fast?" he asked. "Right. But I need to know what the right costs are." He walked through the property with me, taking notes on a yellow legal pad, asking about my priorities and my budget. He didn't try to upsell me on unnecessary work. He didn't promise miracles. He told me what needed to happen, what it would cost, and how long it would take. The numbers matched what I'd projected, give or take 10%. "I can work in phases," he said. "Electrical first, then plumbing, then cosmetic. More expensive per hour than doing it all at once, but you can adjust as you go if something surprises us." Something always surprises us. He almost smiled. "Yeah, it does." We shook hands on it. He started the next Monday. I pulled permits myself instead of delegating, not because it was efficient, but because it removed ambiguity. I spent hours at the city planning office learning the process, understanding the requirements, building relationships with the clerks who controlled the timelines. When the city inspector flagged issues, I didn't argue intent. I asked what documentation would clear them. The difference matters. One creates resistance, the other creates a path. I'd spent 20 years in corporate environments watching people fight with systems instead of learning to work within them. The systems always won. The people who succeeded were the ones who understood the rules well enough to use them. By week 3, the numbers shifted. Not enough to break the deal, enough to force restraint. The electrical upgrade came in 12%, overestimate a junction box in the basement that turned out to be more corroded than it looked from outside. Marcus called me to explain, his voice matter of fact. "I can cut corners to hit the original number," he said. "But I wouldn't recommend it. Do it right. I'll adjust somewhere else." I adjusted the scope instead of the timeline. Deferred what didn't affect habitability. The cosmetic updates to the vacant unit could wait another month. Prioritized compliance and function. The electrical panel, the plumbing documentation, the safety issues the inspector had flagged. I wasn't building a showcase. I was stabilizing an asset so it could carry its own weight. Harold renewed without negotiating. I'd expected him to push for a lower rent given the construction disruption, but he signed the new lease the same day I sent it over. That told me more than any spreadsheet projection. He was staying because he believed the building was getting better, not worse. Stability announces itself quietly in the decisions people make when they don't have to explain them. The vacant unit leased within 10 days of listing, priced conservatively, screened carefully. A young couple, both teachers at the elementary school 3 blocks away. They asked about the neighborhood, the schools, the long-term plans. They weren't looking for luxury. They were looking for something solid. "We've seen a lot of places," the woman said during the showing. "Most of them feel like nobody cares about them." "This one's being taken care of," I said. "It's not fancy, but it's solid." They looked at each other the way couples do when they're communicating without words. Then they asked for an application. When the first rent cleared, both units paying both on time, the numbers finally moving in the right direction, it didn't feel like a win. It felt like confirmation that the system worked, if you respected it. The margin was thin, the work was ongoing, but the foundation was set. That night, I didn't celebrate. I sat at my kitchen table with the loan documents spread out in front of me and reviewed every covenant that mattered. Payment dates, reserve requirements, insurance minimums. I set reminders in my calendar for each one, building a system that would catch me before I could fall. Then I poured myself a glass of wine, the first alcohol I'd had since signing the closing documents, and let myself feel something other than vigilance. Not triumph, not relief, something quieter. Confirmation that I could do this, that the skills I'd built over 20 years weren't worthless just because someone had decided I was too expensive. That starting over at 42 didn't mean starting from nothing. A month later, someone at a networking event asked how I'd found the deal. He was younger than me, eager in the way people are when they think success is about discovering secrets rather than doing work. I didn't find it, I said. I stayed with it long enough to understand it. He nodded, but I could tell he didn't really hear me. He wanted a shortcut, a trick, a connection that would give him access to opportunities other people missed. He didn't want to hear that the opportunity had been visible to everyone, that a dozen other buyers had looked at the same listing and walked away, that the only difference between them and me was that I'd been willing to do the work they weren't. There's a difference people only learn after missing it a few times. Finding deals is easy, understanding them is hard. And staying with them through the friction, through the setbacks, through the nights when you lie awake wondering if you've made a terrible mistake, that's the part nobody wants to talk about. I finished my drink and went home to check on the latest permit application. There was always more work to do. That was the point. I heard my name before anyone addressed me directly, carried across the room in someone else's voice, attached to a sentence that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to commit. It wasn't praise. It wasn't curiosity. It was positioning. The duplex had moved from fragile to viable, not through announcements or confidence, but because the numbers stopped fighting back. Debt service covered, expenses stabilized, rent arriving on schedule instead of on promise. Both units occupied both tenants, paying neither, requiring the kind of attention that erodes margins invisibly. I didn't mark the moment. I watched what followed. Attention always arrives with a cost, and I wanted to see who planned to invoice me for it. When people began referencing my work without checking whether I wanted the association, I knew the shift had already occurred. Money changes the grammar of conversation long before it changes the tone. The first outreach came from people who had once declined to meet. Calendars that had been full suddenly had openings. Their voices softened their phrasing, careful, as if distance could be revised retroactively. They asked how things were going, not because they didn't know, but because they wanted confirmation they could safely acknowledge it now. I listened without correcting timelines or filling in memory gaps. There was no need. This wasn't respect returning. It was a recalibration. I could hear it in the way they spoke around commitment, in how praise hovered without landing anywhere binding. They wanted proximity without accountability, upside without authorship. I noted the pattern and kept my answers brief. Interest that arrives late always wants to be treated as foresight. A proposal followed, delivered by a man named Victor Haynes, who wore his success like a pressed shirt, visible, intentional, meant to be noticed. He had the kind of tan that comes from leisure, the kind of watch that starts conversations. He framed it as collaborative, balanced, mutually beneficial, the kind of language designed to sound equitable without ever proving it. "I've been watching what you're doing," he said over coffee, his smile practiced. "Small-scale stabilization, thoughtful, but you're going to hit a ceiling without capital partners." When I asked who would have final decision authority, his answer diffused into generalities. When I asked how downside would be shared if assumptions failed, the response tightened. "That's the beauty of partnership," he said. "We figure it out together." The structure, as he described it, placed execution and exposure on my side while reserving control elsewhere. I didn't challenge it directly. I asked again from another angle. The evasion repeated. That was enough. Power rarely declares itself openly. It hides in the sections people hope you skim. Then came Gordon Wells' self-appointed mentor, generous with guidance that arrived already annotated.
He was in his 60s, silver-haired with the kind of handshake that lingered a beat too long. He spoke easily about his experience, positioning it as something transferable by proximity alone. "I've seen dozens of people like you," he said, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of someone who has never been interrupted. "Talented, driven, but talent without guidance burns out." He praised my judgment while correcting it mid-sentence, framing his involvement as the natural next step in my progression. I paid attention to how he told his stories. Every success featured his direction. Every failure belonged to someone who hadn't listened closely enough. He wanted a narrative where I advanced, but never arrived. I didn't interrupt. You learn a great deal by letting someone finish explaining why they should be in charge of your momentum. The decision point wasn't dramatic. It didn't arrive with conflict or confrontation. It arrived with clarity. I chose slower progress without surrendering authority over faster movement that required it. I declined both offers, politely, without justification or alternative proposals. Victor's face tightened for just a moment before the mask returned. "You're making a mistake," he said. "This market doesn't wait." Gordon was gentler, almost paternal. "I understand, but when you're ready for real guidance, call me." The silence that followed was immediate and informative. Pressure surfaced quickly, first disguised as concern, then less carefully. A few doors hesitated. One closed. Someone at a conference mentioned I was difficult to work with. I didn't respond. Reputation built through repeated behavior doesn't need defense. It needs consistency. Work continued without spectacle. The duplex performed. I began researching a second property, a 4-unit building with deferred maintenance and an owner looking to exit. The project advanced because it was structured to do so, not because anyone approved of it. One person didn't engage at all. A man I'd seen at several events, always at the edge of conversations, never inserting himself. He didn't reach out or signal interest. He observed from a distance, attentive without urgency. That restraint registered. Serious participants don't rush access. They wait to see how you handle leverage when no one is negotiating yet. I noted it without assigning meaning. Meanwhile, my mother called. Not to ask about me, to mention that Kevin had run into someone who mentioned they'd seen me at a real estate event. "I didn't know you were doing that," she said. Her tone was careful probing. "I am." A pause. "Well, that's interesting." She didn't ask for details. She didn't wish me luck. The call ended with the same nothing it had started with. But I noticed she had called. The information was traveling, and that meant the questions would follow. Her name was Meredith Tan, and she arrived the way useful people often do, without fanfare, without agenda, just competence, wrapped in patience. We met at a property management seminar, one of those events where half the room is selling something and the other half is pretending not to notice. The conference room smelled like stale coffee and carpet cleaner rows of folding chairs filled with investors, property managers, and the occasional hopeful newcomer trying to figure out where they fit. She wasn't selling. She was taking notes. Actual notes, not the performative kind that people make to look engaged while their minds wander elsewhere. Her pen moved steadily across a legal pad, capturing specifics, while others around her scrolled through phones or whispered to neighbors. When the speaker made a claim about vacancy rates that didn't match the market I'd been studying, a confident assertion about single-digit turnover that sounded good but didn't hold up against actual data, she leaned over and said quietly, "That number's off by about 12%. She was right. I knew because I'd spent the previous month pulling county records and cross-referencing them with listing histories. The speaker was using national averages, not local reality. The fact that she'd caught the same discrepancy told me she'd done similar homework. After the session, we talked for 20 minutes in the hallway while others filtered toward the coffee station. She had a direct way of speaking that I appreciated. No excessive qualifiers, no verbal hedging. We discussed tenant screening protocols and lease enforcement timelines, the practical mechanics that separate operators who survive from those who don't. She'd spent 8 years managing a portfolio of mixed-use properties for an investor who had recently relocated to another state. The transition had left her between positions, looking for something that matched her pace.
Most people in this industry want to scale fast, she said. I'd rather scale right. It was the kind of statement that could have been empty, the sort of thing people say to sound thoughtful without meaning anything. But the way she said it, matter of fact and without emphasis, made me believe she meant it. I didn't hire her immediately. I watched first. Trust is expensive when you're building something alone, and I'd already learned that lesson in ways I didn't need to repeat. I gave her small tasks, research on comparable properties, documentation of permit processes in neighboring municipalities. Nothing that required access to my numbers or my plans. She completed everything ahead of schedule accurately without asking for praise or hinting at wanting more responsibility. We had coffee twice during those first weeks. She asked good questions, not about my strategy or my finances, but about the neighborhood dynamics I was studying, the tenant profiles I was targeting, the long-term vision I was building toward. She listened more than she spoke, which was rare. Most people in this industry use conversations as opportunities to demonstrate their own expertise. Meredith seemed genuinely curious about mine. "You're not like the other investors I've worked with," she said during our second meeting. "You actually read the documents." "That's a low bar," she smiled slightly. "You'd be surprised how few people clear it." Over the following weeks, I let her in further. Not all the way, but enough. A segment of my acquisition strategy, the types of properties I was targeting, the neighborhoods I was watching. A range of numbers, without the assumptions beneath them enough to align on goals, without exposing my exact calculations. A direction that suggested movement without revealing timing. It was the kind of controlled transparency that lets you work with someone while maintaining the walls you need to protect yourself. She nodded, took notes, and mirrored my language back to me in ways that felt careful. When I mentioned prioritizing tenant stability over maximum rent extraction, she used the same phrase in a follow-up email. When I described my approach as patient capital, she adopted the term. I told myself this was what competence looked like when it wasn't loud. Someone who paid attention, who absorbed methodology, who aligned without demanding credit. The door stayed open halfway, exactly where I intended. There was a moment, I remember it clearly now, though I didn't recognize its significance at the time, when something should have registered as warning. We were reviewing a property analysis she'd prepared, and she mentioned a detail about the seller's timeline that I hadn't shared with her. "Where did you hear that?" I asked. "I think you mentioned it last week," she said smoothly. "During our call about the Maple Street numbers." I hadn't. I was certain I hadn't. But the explanation was plausible enough, and I was tired, and the detail itself wasn't critical, so I let it pass. That's how these things work. The first breach is always small enough to explain away. By the time the pattern becomes clear, the damage is already spreading. The first undeniable sign arrived quietly disguised as coincidence. I was at a meeting with a potential lender discussing terms for my next acquisition, the 4-unit I'd been researching on Maple Street. The conversation was going well. He'd reviewed my documentation, asked intelligent questions about my stabilization timeline, seemed genuinely interested in the deal, rather than just trying to sell me on unsuitable products. Midway through, he referenced a constraint I hadn't discussed outside my own notes, the specific timeline I'd mapped for closing down to the week. "Meredith mentioned you were looking at a fast close," he said casually. "That changes the rate structure. We might need to expedite the appraisal." I kept my face neutral, but something cold moved through my chest. "She did. We had coffee last week. She's been helpful connecting people. Said she's been working with you on the portfolio expansion." I smiled and redirected the conversation back to terms. But my mind was already working through the implications. I hadn't told Meredith about my closing timeline. I hadn't told her I was meeting with this lender. I certainly hadn't authorized her to position herself as working with me on anything. Information leaks don't announce themselves with confessions. They surface through repetition, through details that appear where they shouldn't, through the quiet accumulation of coincidences that stop being coincidental once you start paying attention. A second instance followed 2 days later. A contractor I hadn't contacted yet called me directly, mentioning he'd heard I was looking for someone who could handle phased electrical work. That phrase, phased electrical work, was mine. From a document I'd shared only with Meredith, a preliminary scope description for the Maple Street renovation. I'd used those exact words because they described the approach I wanted: staged upgrades that would allow me to maintain occupancy while bringing the building up to code. "Who mentioned my name?" I asked. "A woman I met at a networking thing," he said. "Meredith something. She said you might be in the market for a contractor who understands complicated projects." I thanked him, said I'd be in touch, and ended the call. Then I sat very still for a long time, letting the pieces arrange themselves into a pattern I could no longer ignore. Then a third instance, the most damaging one. A competing buyer on a property I hadn't even made an offer on yet knew my target price range. Not exactly, he was off by about 15%, but close enough to suggest the leak wasn't accidental. He mentioned it casually at an investor meetup, asking if I was planning to bid on the Westbrook Street listing. "I heard you're looking in that range," he said. "Might be too rich for both of us." The range he quoted was from an internal analysis I'd shared with no one except Meredith. I didn't confront her. The impulse was there, the anger, the sense of violation, the desire to demand an explanation that would somehow make it make sense. But anger would have collapsed the timeline into noise. I needed distance, not relief. I needed to understand the full scope of the breach before I closed it. Instead, I started tracking. I created a spreadsheet, dates, conversations, documents, shared information that appeared where it shouldn't. I mapped the timeline against my communications with Meredith, cross-checked language across emails, watched how responsibility drifted, and then snapped back into place when stakes appeared. The pattern was clear once I stopped hoping it would resolve itself. She had been systematically mining my strategy and distributing it to contacts who might find it valuable: lenders, contractors, competing investors. Not selling it exactly, trading it, building a network of favors that she could leverage for her own positioning. I didn't cut her off immediately. I narrowed the flow instead. Permissions changed without announcement. Access thinned. Decisions rerouted. I started feeding her information that was plausible, but slightly incorrect timelines shifted by a week, price ranges adjusted by 10% priorities reordered. If any of those details surfaced elsewhere, I would know exactly where they'd come from. I wanted to see how far she'd go when the road stopped responding the way she expected. This wasn't mercy. It was a measurement. If you rush to end a breach, you learn nothing. If you let it breathe, it teaches you where the walls actually are. The poisoned information started appearing within days. A lender mentioned a timeline that matched my false version. A contractor referenced a budget number I'd deliberately inflated. The confirmation was complete. There was no ambiguity left to hide behind. A week after I restricted her access, she called me. I was standing in the kitchen of my apartment watching rain streak down the window when her name appeared on my phone. I let it ring twice before answering. "I haven't seen the updated pro forma for the Maple Street property," she said. Her voice was the same as always, professional, confident, faintly collaborative. "I wanted to make sure I'm aligned before the lender meeting." "There isn't going to be a lender meeting," I said. "I'm restructuring the approach." Silence on the line. I could almost hear her recalculating, trying to understand what had changed and how much I knew. Then, "I could help with that. I have some contacts who might be interested in the revised structure." "I'm sure you do." The pause that followed was long enough to confirm everything. She knew I knew, and now she knew I wasn't going to name it directly. There would be no confrontation, no accusation, no opportunity for her to defend herself or reframe the narrative. Just a door closing. "Riley," she said carefully, "if there's been some kind of misunderstanding, there hasn't." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I just let the sentence sit where it landed, heavy and final. "I've appreciated your help," I said, "but I'll be handling things differently going forward." She tried once more to explain, to reframe, to position herself as misunderstood rather than calculated. She talked about communication styles and assumptions and the complexity of professional relationships. She suggested that perhaps there had been some confusion about boundaries, about what information was meant to be shared and what wasn't. She was good at it, the verbal maneuvering, the subtle suggestion that maybe I was the one who had miscommunicated. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I thanked her for her time and ended the call. No confrontation, no dramatic exit,
just a door closing quietly the way it should have opened in the first place. I sat on my couch for a long time after that call, not moving, not thinking, just letting the silence settle. The apartment was dark except for the gray light filtering through the rain-streaked windows. I thought about calling someone, my former colleague, who'd validated my competence months ago maybe, or one of the other investors I'd started building relationships with. But what would I say? That someone I'd trusted had used that trust against me, that I'd been foolish enough to let my guard down. The truth was simpler and harder. I had wanted to believe that competence and alignment were the same thing. I had wanted to believe that someone who shared my language also shared my values. That was my mistake, and it was mine alone. Over the following weeks, I watched her version of events unravel. The confidence that comes from borrowed structure evaporates when the scaffolding moves. Meetings she'd set up lost momentum because she couldn't deliver the access she'd implied she had. Promises she'd made to others stalled because the information she'd been trading was no longer current. People asked questions she couldn't answer without circling back to a source she no longer had access to. I heard about it secondhand mostly. A lender mentioned that she'd gone quiet. A contractor said she'd canceled a meeting without explanation. Someone at a networking event noted that she seemed to be repositioning, looking for a new anchor to attach herself to. The silence around her grew dense. Not punitive, I hadn't said anything to anyone about what had happened. Just accurate. When you build your position on someone else's foundation, you collapse when they move. What surprised me wasn't the betrayal. Betrayal is common enough in any competitive environment. People look out for themselves. They calculate advantage. They make choices that serve their interests over yours. I understood that. I had always understood that. What surprised me was how clean the clarity felt afterward. Trust hadn't been destroyed. It had been refined. I knew now with precision what I was willing to share and what I wasn't. I knew how to structure access so that a breach in one area wouldn't compromise others. I knew how to watch for the signs I'd missed, before the borrowed language, the questions that probed too specifically, the coincidences that accumulated into patterns. I didn't feel smaller. I felt more exact. I spent the next week rewiring how information moved through my operation. I documented decision authority explicitly. Who could approve what, who needed to be consulted, who had access to which files. I created separate channels for separate purposes so that a compromise in one wouldn't leak into others. I built systems that could be traced without being trap transparent enough to function, but compartmentalized enough to contain damage. Power doesn't require secrecy. It requires design. The structure I built wasn't about hiding what I was doing. It was about controlling who could access it and when. By the end of the month, I could feel a different kind of presence nearby. The man I'd noticed at events, the one who watched without approaching, who stood at the edges of conversations observing rather than participating, finally made contact. A single email appeared in my inbox on a Tuesday morning. 3 sentences. I've been following your work on the East Side duplex. Your restraint during the Haynes situation was noted. If you're open to a conversation about the 4-unit on Maple, I'd like to hear your thoughts. No flattery, no urgency, no positioning or leverage or subtle requests for information, just recognition offered without strings. I read the email 3 times. The name at the bottom, Daniel Rowe, was familiar from the events where I'd seen him watching. I'd wondered occasionally what he was looking for. Now I had an answer, or at least the beginning of one. I didn't respond immediately. Timing matters. A reply too fast suggests eagerness. Too slow suggests disinterest. I wanted him to understand that I was considering carefully, that access to my thinking wasn't given automatically. But I saved the email, I flagged it for follow-up, and I let myself consider for the first time what it might mean to have someone watching who was interested in restraint rather than aggression. Trust placed correctly compounds. I had learned what happened when it was placed incorrectly. Now I would learn what happened when the placement was right. His name was Daniel Rowe, and he didn't approach with enthusiasm or apology, which is how I knew it mattered. We'd crossed paths before in the periphery of rooms where people talked too loudly about certainty. His presence steady and unremarkable until you realized he'd been listening longer than most. Late 50s, gray at the temples, clothes that fit well but didn't announce themselves. The kind of person who could afford to be louder and chose not to be. When we finally met for coffee, his suggestion a quiet place away from the usual networking circuits, he didn't waste time on pleasantries. "You walked away from Victor Haynes," he said. "That takes either stupidity or conviction. I'm betting on conviction." "You could be wrong." "I could, but I'm usually not." He asked about the duplex, not the numbers, those were public enough if you knew where to look. He asked about the decisions, why I'd chosen phased renovations over a full gut, why I'd kept Harold as a tenant when I could have pushed for market rate, why I'd waited 3 weeks before listing the vacant unit instead of rushing to fill it. I answered without shaping the responses to impress. The exchange felt oddly level, like two people mapping terrain instead of negotiating ground. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't being measured against my age, my recent losses, or the story people like to tell about momentum. I was being assessed on thinking. He didn't position himself as a guide. There were no instructions disguised as wisdom, no anecdotes meant to assert seniority. When I paused, he waited. When I withheld detail, he didn't push. "I have capital," he said eventually, "and I have patience. What I don't have is time to manage properties myself. I'm looking for an operator, someone who can make decisions without asking permission and live with the consequences." That's a lot of trust to place in someone you've had one coffee with. "I've been watching for 6 months. This is confirmation, not discovery." I tested him without making it obvious. I offered a scenario about the Maple Street 4 unit, a choice that would force trade-offs without offering certainty. I left out key variables and waited to see if he'd demand them. He didn't. He talked through consequences without assuming access, acknowledged the missing pieces without trying to extract them, and outlined options instead of prescriptions. Comfort with not knowing is rare. Respect for someone else's timing is rarer. When the proposal came, it arrived without pressure. "I put up the capital for Maple Street. You run the acquisition and the stabilization. We split equity 60-40, you keep management authority. If it works, we do it again. If it doesn't, we learn something." "I'll need everything in writing," I said. "Decision authority, exit terms, dispute resolution." "I'd be concerned if you didn't." We started with Maple Street. With Maple. One decision contained exposure, one move that would reveal whether alignment held under stress. Roles were defined in ink, not assumption. Authority was explicit, not negotiable. When friction appeared during the acquisition, a title issue that delayed closing by 2 weeks, it surfaced cleanly and resolved without ego. No one reached for credit. No one stepped over lines to secure advantage. We acquired Maple Street, stabilized it in 4 months. Both buildings, the duplex and the 4-unit now cash-flowing tenant stable systems, documented. Daniel never once suggested he knew better. He asked questions, reviewed numbers, and trusted the answers I gave. And somewhere in the background noise of family channels I no longer monitored closely, my name was starting to travel. My aunt called my mother to ask if I was doing real estate now. My mother, I learned later, said she wasn't sure, but the question had been asked. And questions once asked don't stay quiet for long. The invitation came through a production company I'd never heard of, forwarded to me by someone I'd met once at a housing policy forum. A regional business program syndicated across 3 states focused on economic recovery and workforce housing. They were doing a segment on small-scale operators who had stabilized properties without displacing tenants. Someone had mentioned my name. I almost deleted the email. The subject line looked like spam media inquiry regional business spotlight. And I'd learned to be skeptical of anything that promised exposure without specifying what kind. But something made me read past the first paragraph, maybe the specificity of the request, or the absence of the usual flattering language that signals someone trying to sell you something. The email was brief and professional. They wanted to interview me for a 12-minute segment on capital-efficient property stabilization. Not a feel-good story about overcoming adversity. Not a human interest piece about a woman breaking into a male-dominated industry.
A working conversation about process risk and replicable models. They'd reviewed public records on my acquisitions. They'd spoken to tenants. Harold's name was mentioned specifically. They wanted to understand the methodology, not just celebrate the outcome. I read the email 3 times. Then I called Daniel. "What do you think?" I asked. "I think visibility has costs and benefits," he said. "The question is whether you're ready for both." "What are the costs?" "People will know what you're building. Some of them will want to compete with it. Some will want to copy it. Some will want to attach themselves to it." "And the benefits?" "Credibility you can't buy, access to conversations you're not currently in, and," he paused, "proof, the kind that doesn't require explanation." I thought about my family, about Kevin's laugh at the dinner table, about my mother's suggestion that I try cleaning jobs, about the careful silence that had followed me for months, the assumption that my life was a problem to be managed rather than a trajectory to be respected. "I'll do it," I said. The studio was smaller than I expected, but more serious. A converted warehouse space in the industrial district, exposed brick walls and high ceilings equipment that looked professional without being ostentatious. No dramatic lighting designed to make subjects look heroic. No soft focus inspirational music playing in the background. Just a table, 2 chairs, and a host named Patricia Vance, who had clearly done her homework. She was in her 50s, gray streaking through dark hair that she hadn't bothered to dye, reading glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed notes on a tablet. When I walked in, she stood and shook my hand firmly, no smile, just assessment. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I know your time is valuable." "So is yours. What do you need from me?" She almost smiled at that. "Directness. Good. Let's skip the origin story," she said as we settled into our chairs. "Everyone has one. Layoff, pivot, second act, I've heard 100 versions. I want to know how the math works." The camera operator made a small adjustment. The sound technician gave a thumbs up. Patricia looked at me, with the focused attention of someone who was genuinely curious rather than performing curiosity for an audience. "Ready when you are," she said. The interview lasted 40 minutes. They would cut it down to 12, but the questions stayed technical throughout. Patricia had done more research than I'd expected. She'd pulled permit records, reviewed county assessor data, even talked to the inspector who'd signed off on my electrical upgrade. "You acquired a distressed duplex with unpermitted plumbing and an outdated electrical panel. Walk me through the decision to close anyway." I explained the inspection findings, the 7 roof patches, the rerouted plumbing, the 60-amp service that needed to become 200. I walked through the price adjustment I'd negotiated, based on those findings the way I'd calculated repair costs against potential rental income, the margin of error I'd built into every projection. "Most buyers would have walked away at the inspection report," Patricia said. "Most buyers were looking for a different kind of deal. They wanted something clean, something they could close quickly and flip or rent without complications. I was looking for something I could understand completely. The problems in that building were documented. The risks were quantifiable. That's actually safer than buying something that looks perfect on the surface but hasn't been examined carefully." She made a note. "Walk me through the renovation strategy." "Matt, I talked about pulling permits myself, instead of delegating about the relationship with Marcus, about working with a single contractor instead of a general. I explained the difference between cosmetic value add, the kind of renovation that looks impressive in photos, but doesn't address underlying issues, and structural stabilization, which prioritizes function and compliance over aesthetics. You spent more per square foot than comparable renovations in that neighborhood, Patricia observed. Why? Because I wasn't trying to flip the building. I was trying to own it for decades. The cost of doing things right once is always lower than the cost of doing things cheaply multiple times. Every shortcut you take in renovation becomes a maintenance problem later. I'd rather have higher upfront costs and lower ongoing expenses than the reverse. Your tenant in the original unit, Harold, stayed through the renovation. Why keep him? This question I'd anticipated. It was the one that would make me sound either sentimental or calculating, depending on how I answered it. I chose honesty.
He was paying on time. He'd been in that unit for 11 years, which meant he knew the building better than I did, every quirk, every seasonal issue, every maintenance pattern. When the water pressure dropped, he could tell me exactly when it had started and what had changed. That kind of institutional knowledge is valuable. I paused, considering how much more to say. But it's more than that. Stability isn't just a financial metric. When you displace long-term tenants to maximize rent, you're not just losing their knowledge, you're signaling to the neighborhood that the building is in flux. Other tenants get nervous. Prospective tenants wonder what kind of landlord you are. The community watches how you treat people. Harold Stang told everyone that I was someone who honored existing relationships. That reputation is worth more than the marginal rent increase I could have gotten by pushing him out. Patricia nodded slowly. You've since acquired a second property, a 4-unit on Maple Street in partnership with an outside investor. What changed? Nothing changed. The model scaled. You went from solo operator to partnership. That's not nothing. The methodology stayed the same. Distressed property clear documentation of problems, phased renovation, prioritizing compliance, and function tenant retention where possible. The only difference was the capital structure. I brought in a partner who shared the investment philosophy and was willing to let me maintain operational control. How did you find that partner? I thought about Daniel's email, the restraint he'd noticed, the patience he'd demonstrated. He found me. He'd been watching how I handled the first property, not just the financial outcomes, but the decisions along the way. He reached out when he was confident we were aligned. Some would call that lucky, Patricia said. Some would be wrong. There was a pause. The camera kept rolling. Patricia smiled slightly, the first real smile I'd seen from her since we started. You're not interested in being liked, are you? I'm interested in being accurate. Being liked is a byproduct of doing good work. If you chase it directly, you end up making decisions based on how they'll be perceived rather than whether they're correct. I'd rather be respected than liked, and I'd rather be effective than either. What would you tell someone who's considering a similar path, someone who's been displaced from a corporate career and is thinking about real estate as a second act? I considered the question carefully. There were a dozen easy answers. Believe in yourself. Take calculated risks. Don't let setbacks define you. All of them were true enough to be useless. I'd tell them to learn the math before they learn the market. Understand debt service ratios, cap rates, cash-on-cash returns. Understand how insurance and taxes erode margins over time. Most people fail in real estate, not because they buy bad properties, but because they don't understand their own numbers well enough to survive the first setback. What else? I'd tell them that the skills they developed in their previous career are more transferable than they think, but not in the ways they expect. My corporate experience didn't teach me how to evaluate properties or negotiate with contractors, but it taught me how to read documents carefully, how to manage projects with multiple dependencies, how to make decisions with incomplete information. Those skills translate. You just have to figure out how to apply them in a new context. And if they're not sure they can do it, then they should start smaller than they think they need to. Buy something ugly that scares other buyers away. Something with documented problems and quantifiable risks. Stay with it long enough to understand it completely. If you can stabilize one building, you can stabilize 10. But you have to prove it to yourself first. Patricia made a final note and looked up. I think we have what we need. The segment aired 3 weeks later on a Tuesday evening at 7. I didn't watch it live. I was sitting at my kitchen table reviewing lease renewals for both properties, making notes about which tenants were likely to renew and which might need follow-up conversations. The work didn't stop because someone was broadcasting a 12-minute summary of how I did it. My phone started buzzing around 7:15. The first text came from Daniel Clean. Professional. Well done. Then Marcus saw the thing. You made us both look good. Then a colleague from the Housing Policy Forum, excellent segment. We should talk about that nonprofit partnership you mentioned. Then a lender I'd met once at a conference. Let me know if you're looking at any new acquisitions. I'd be interested in discussing terms. The messages kept coming for the next hour. I responded to the ones that required responses and let the others sit. There would be time to follow up tomorrow to sort through which connections were valuable and which were just people attaching themselves to momentary visibility. Around 9 o'clock, I poured myself a glass of wine and finally pulled up the segment on my laptop. I watched myself on screen, answering questions in a voice that sounded more confident than I remembered feeling. The editing was fair. They'd kept my technical explanations intact and hadn't softened my directness into something more palatable. Patricia's voiceover filled in context without editorializing. The segment ended with footage of the Maple Street building tenants coming and going, the quiet stability of a property that functioned the way it was supposed to. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a while, not thinking about anything in particular, just letting the strangeness of it settle. Somewhere out there, people I'd never met were watching a version of my story, drawing conclusions about who I was and what I'd built. The narrative had escaped my control. That was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. 4 days later, a text from Kevin appeared on my phone. "Mom said she saw you on some business show. Didn't know you were doing all that." I stared at the message for a long time. I read it 3 times, looking for something that wasn't there. A question, an expression of pride or surprise, congratulations, even a perfunctory one. Some acknowledged that what I'd built was worth acknowledging. There was nothing. Just an observation delivered as if I owed him an explanation, as if my success was a piece of information he hadn't been given access to, rather than a result of choices he'd watched me make while offering nothing but administrative job suggestions and borrowed concern. I thought about responding. I drafted 3 different messages in my head. The first was defensive. "I've been doing this for over a year. You never asked." The second was conciliatory. "Thanks for reaching out. I'd be happy to tell you about it sometime." The third was honest. "I didn't tell you because you weren't interested. You weren't interested when I lost my job. You weren't interested when I moved out of the house. You weren't interested when I was learning a new industry from scratch. You're only interested now because you saw it on television. I didn't send any of them." I set the phone face down on the table and let the silence answer for me. Some conversations don't need to happen. Some responses would only give him the satisfaction of engagement, the illusion that we were having a dialogue when we'd never had one. My success didn't require his acknowledgement. My story didn't need his participation. I didn't respond. The information was out there now, moving through channels I didn't control, reaching ears I hadn't addressed. My mother had seen it. My father had probably seen it too, though he'd never admit to watching business programming. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in months would hear about it through the family network that had once been used to manage my narrative for me. My name was no longer something they could summarize in a sentence. Not "she's taking a break," or "she's regrouping," or "she's at home for a bit." It was attached to work they couldn't dismiss, to numbers they couldn't argue with, to buildings that existed in the physical world, regardless of what story they wanted to tell about me. That was the real power of visibility. Not the validation I didn't need them to be proud of me, but the evidence, the undeniable proof that their assessment had been wrong, that their predictions had failed, that the future they'd erased with their laughter and their suggestions had been claimed anyway. I started the car and drove to the Maple Street property. There was a maintenance issue to address, a slow drain in one of the second-floor units that probably meant a partial clog somewhere in the lateral line. A small problem. The kind that becomes a big problem if you ignore it. The sun was setting as I pulled up to the building. The brick facade looked warm in the golden light, the windows reflecting the sky. 2 of the tenants were sitting on the front steps talking quietly. They waved when they saw me. I waved back. This is the work now, not television appearances or family confrontations, just buildings that needed attention, tenants who deserved stability, problems that required solutions. The visibility had changed how others saw me. It hadn't changed what I needed to do. I unlocked the basement door and went to look at the drain. There were things to fix. There were always things to fix. That was the job I'd chosen, and I was going to do it whether anyone was watching or not. The message came 2 weeks after the segment aired. "We need to talk. Mom." No question mark. No, when you have time. Just the assumption that the conversation was inevitable, that I would comply as I always had. I stared at the words long enough to register what wasn't there, no acknowledgement that I might say no.
For most of my life, that tone would have been enough to pull me into motion. This time, something else surfaced first. I didn't need anything from them. The leverage had shifted quietly the way it always does when dependency dissolves. I waited 2 days before responding, not to punish them, not to create suspense, to confirm to myself that the choice was mine. When I finally agreed to meet, it wasn't obligation that moved me. It was a curiosity. I wanted to see who they were when they no longer held the frame. We chose a diner off the highway, neither familiar nor symbolic. They arrived first, Mom, Dad, and Kevin sitting in a booth near the window. When I walked in, 3 heads turned. Mom's face was tight. Dad looked tired. Kevin wouldn't meet my eyes. I slid into the seat across from them. No one hugged. No one smiled. "You look good," Mom said. It sounded like a concession. "Thank you." Silence. Dad cleared his throat. "We saw the TV thing. Your mother recorded it." "I didn't know she watched business programming." Mom's jaw tightened. "It was surprising. The things you were saying about properties, investments. It wasn't meant to surprise anyone. It's just work." Kevin finally looked up. "You never mentioned any of this. The real estate stuff. The buildings. You never asked." The words landed harder than I intended, or maybe exactly as I intended. The silence that followed stretched long enough for the waitress to come and go. Mom broke first. "We didn't know you were doing all this. If we had, you would have what?" She stopped. The question sat between us like something fragile. "We're your family," she said finally. "We should have known." "You knew what you wanted to know. That's not the same thing." Dad shifted in his seat. "Riley, we're not here to argue. We just wanted to talk, to understand." "Understand what?" "How things got like this, between us." I could have listed the moments. The dinner where they laughed, the silence when I needed support, the way Kevin's failures were absorbed and mine were diagnosed. I could have walked them through 20 years of being the footnote, the stabilizer, the one who would be fine. But what would be the point? They weren't here to learn. They were here to manage. "You want to know what happened?" I said. "Nothing happened. I just stopped waiting." Kevin leaned forward. Waiting for what? Permission, approval, space at the table. I looked at each of them in turn. "I built something, without your help, without your blessing, and now you're here because you saw it on television." Mom's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "That's not fair." "Maybe not, but it's accurate." The silence stretched again. Dad looked at his plate. Kevin looked at his phone. Mom looked at me with something I almost didn't recognize: uncertainty. "We're not asking for anything," she said quietly. "We just wanted to reconnect." Reconnect to what? The version of me that made you comfortable. That version doesn't exist anymore. You're still our daughter. I am. But I'm not available for the role you're used to. I won't absorb inconvenience to keep the peace. I won't pretend last year didn't happen. And I won't translate my life into something easier for you to explain at dinner parties. Kevin finally spoke. "So what, you're just going to cut us off?" "No, I'm going to set terms. If you want a relationship, it'll be on different grounds. I won't be the one who handles things so everyone else can relax. That's over." The request came then tentative and wrapped in concern the real reason they were here. "There's something else," Mom said. "Kevin's been looking at some investment opportunities. Real estate, actually. We thought maybe you could advise him, make an introduction." I looked at my brother. He had the decency to look uncomfortable. "No," I said. "Riley, no. I'm not a resource you can access when it's convenient. I built this without you. You don't get to draft on it now." Mom's face flushed. "That's cold." "It's clear. There's a difference." I stood, leaving my untouched coffee on the table. "I don't hate you," I said. "I don't want to hurt you. But I'm not coming back, not to the roles you remember, not to the expectations that required me to shrink so you could feel stable." No one said anything. "If you want something different, something honest, we can try. But not like this. Not because you saw me on television and decided I might be useful again." I walked out without looking back. The air outside was cold and sharp. I got in my car, sat for a moment, and let the silence settle. There was no triumph in it, no satisfaction, just the clean, irreversible weight of a decision that had been waiting years to be made. I drove back to work. There were things to do. The day moved forward without asking for meaning, which was how I knew it was real. I woke before my alarm, the room still gray with early light, and lay there for a moment, listening to the quiet. No urgency, no dread. Just the ordinary stillness of a morning that didn't require anything from me, except presence. I skimmed a short list of notes I'd written the night before. Follow up with the insurance adjuster review. Marcus's invoice confirm Thursday's inspection time. I approved 2 decisions that didn't feel heavy anymore, choices that once would have kept me awake, but now passed through my mind without friction. I sent 1 email that only needed a single sentence, confirmed for Thursday 10 a.m. The rest of the morning unfolded the way functional systems do when nothing is stuck waiting for permission. Coffee brewed while I showered, clothes laid out the night before, keys and phone in the same place they always were. The choreography of a life that ran on structure rather than adrenaline. No one applauded, no one waited for a quote. There was nothing to prove and no one to convince. The quiet efficiency of it felt like confirmation, not of success exactly, but of something sturdier. Tomorrow would look like today, and that was enough. I drove to Maple Street first, following a route I no longer had to think about. Past the coffee shop on the corner, past the playground where mothers gathered with strollers. The neighborhood hadn't changed. I had. I could read its patterns now without effort, the rhythm of traffic, the timing of garbage collection, the subtle shifts in occupancy that signaled stability or drift. The 4-unit was fully occupied, rent current, systems aligned. The electrical panel that had failed my first inspection was now a clean 200-amp service permitted and documented. The plumbing that had once been a liability was compliant, every pipe mapped. The roof still carried its patches, but they were holding, and the reserve fund for replacement was already in place. Marcus was finishing punch list items on the 2nd floor when I walked in. He looked up from the baseboard he was caulking and waved his hands white with residue. "Inspection's Thursday," he said. "We'll pass." I know, that was all. After 3 buildings together, we didn't need explanations. He did what he said he would do. I paid what I said I would pay. Everything else was execution. I walked the building, slowly checking details that didn't really need checking. The window latch in 2B smooth now, the old water stain in 1A dry stable, the hallway light steady. This was the work now. Not speeches, not revelations. Maintenance repeated daily until buildings ran the way they were meant to. Around noon, I stopped at the coffee place near the duplex Grace's, though the sign only said coffee. Harold was still in the downstairs unit of my first building, 3 years running, rent paid on the first without fail. The young couple upstairs had asked for a 2-year renewal. Stability announces itself quietly. Grace nodded when I walked in. The usual, "Please, black coffee, no sugar." She didn't ask. She never did anymore. "How's the building?" she asked. "Stable. Harold's still fixing things himself, only when I'm not looking." She smiled. "Reliable man." I took my coffee to the table by the window, the same one I'd sat at years earlier when I was still watching this neighborhood and wondering if I belonged in it. The view hadn't changed. The difference was that my presence no longer felt provisional. My phone buzzed. "Kevin, I haven't heard from you since the dinner. Just checking in. I read it once. Then again." The words carried no question, no accountability. I thought about the diner, about the request that followed the concern, about the assumption that access returned once visibility did. I typed, "I'm fine, busy with work." I sent it. That was enough. My family existed at the edge of my life now, not absent, just distant. Brief updates when necessary. No explanations, no negotiations. Distance had become a posture rather than a statement, sustainable, quiet. After coffee, I drove to a 6-unit I'd been watching for months. Brick facade, deferred maintenance, solid bones. The owner, Ruth, met me at the door keys on a chain around her neck. "I don't like showing the place to strangers," she said. "I'm a buyer," I said. "There's a difference." She nodded. She understood. We walked slowly through the building, paint peeling, fixtures outdated, 1 vacant unit from a failed water heater,
Tenants who stayed because the rent was fair and the landlord had been decent. I don't want them pushed out, she said. That's my condition. I don't push people out, I said. I stabilize buildings. She studied me for a long moment, then smiled. I saw the interview, she said. It confirmed something I hoped was true. What's that? That you mean what you say. We shook hands. I promised an offer by the end of the week. Driving home, I passed the diner where I'd met my family. I didn't slow down. It disappeared behind me like any other building. That night, I sat with a spreadsheet open. Conservative numbers, worst-case scenarios mapped cleanly. The deal worked not spectacularly, but honestly. A third building, a portfolio that could stand on its own. This was the work, not revenge, not validation. Taking care of buildings, keeping systems stable, passing things forward in better condition than I'd found them. There was no sense of arrival, only continuity. I closed the laptop and stood by the window, city lights steady below. Somewhere my family was living their version of the story. I was living mine. They didn't lose me when I failed. They lost access when I succeeded. I closed the curtains and went to bed.